Okay. Just to set the context here and to remind you of where we've been, where we are. Recall that our last time together, which was on Thursday, we read the piece on rural farmers, which, by the way, is a chapter out of the same book written by the same author as the chapter that we read today about, well, for lack of a better term, industrial workers or industrial factory workers, okay? Remember that the overarching argument, or one of the overarching arguments that Professor or Dr. Fraser, whoever he is, the author, one of the things that he's arguing is that in very important and interesting ways, though we might think that these people and their culture and these people and their culture are very different from one another, because after all, we tend to think of farmers as living in rural America. We tend to think of industrial factory workers living in big cities. One of the implicit things in this piece is that, in fact, there were millions of industrial factory workers in small towns, relatively small towns, okay? All of them, of course, located somewhere on the railroads, so that product, industrial product, can be transported from point A to point B and points beyond, right? So that in economic terms, what we want you to see is that the industrialization of the country, which was an ongoing process, or the development of what we might call unfettered capitalism, and by unfettered we mean largely unregulated, or to use the terms that Fraser is using, we might think of what's called primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation is the way in which big business accumulates excess capital so that they can then invest that excess capital in further growth, you would hope, right? But of course, one of the things that unites the rural farmers with the industrial factory workers in the story that we're reading, one of the things that unites them is the fact that both groups, as a result of this third group, are suffering from low pay and, in the most general terms, harsh or punitive economic and working conditions. So that, we understand that the daily grind, the quotidian, to use a fancy word, the daily life of the workers, whether we're talking about rural farmers or industrial workers, is really quite different. Which is to say, for instance, that if you're working in a mine 12 hours a day, you're underground. Very dangerous air, water up to your knees, maybe some feces and urine in the water, all kinds of pollutants that you're working in. If you're working in a steel factory, you're working around hot iron all the time, furnaces. It's like working in a fire context, being a firefighter or something. So industrial workers have one quotidian. Rural farmers have another quotidian, which is to say they're out, trying to get their crops to grow, they're trying to harvest, they're trying to fertilize, whatever the case may be. Granted, those are very different lifestyles. And by the way, let me add that the difference between rural America and either big city, urban, industrialized America, or for that matter, small town industrialized America, I understand that the culture is going to be different too, right? So, we have to account for that, and by the culture being different, I mean farmers have very different concerns than industrial workers. But the point that I'm trying to get you to see, and I think what Fraser wants us to see, is that one of the important historical dynamics at the end of the 19th century, in what we call the populist period, and what we call the progressive period, one of the realities was that big business was running roughshod over its workers. Big business had the courts in their pocket. Big business had capital and the banks in their pocket. In fact, big business was the banks, right? There's a very high level of political corruption, which we haven't talked about, but another reality, of course, of this period was an attempt by what we might call proto-progressives, early progressives, to minimize corruption in government. The patronage system, it was called. So by the 1860s and 1870s, it was very common for what were called political machines, that is to say, not elected representatives, but organizations in the cities, let's say, to influence politicians to do what the political machines wanted them to do. And what this meant was that the appointed officials in government, not the elected officials, but the appointed officials in government, the bureaucrats, if you will, the unelected bureaucrats that work in local government, let's say, were influenced heavily by both the political machines, but also by, shall we say, big business. I think it was in this reading, although it may have been this reading, I'm not sure, mention was made that senators, national senators, elected national senators from the states, that it was just common knowledge that one of them was owned by the railroads, one of them was owned by the banks, one of them was owned by the mining interests. They were literally, and everybody knew it, senators for that particular sector of industrialized society. So when I say all of that, not all of that, but the last couple of minutes, I'm trying to paint a picture of how big business not only controlled, shall we say, most of the money in the economy, but they also controlled the politicians, including sometimes the judges. And another level of, shall we say, another level of, what's the word? Another level of imposition, of subjugation of either these people or these people, is the fact that along the way the courts stepped in, making it, frankly, illegal to engage in collective activity. Right? And it got so, oppositional that both state governors and even U.S. presidents sent in the troops ostensibly to restore order, but you could argue they did it to safeguard the profits of the property-owning class. And so, in a sense, notice, you can think of industrial factory workers as propertyless, which is to say they are simply wage earners. They don't own anything except their labor, their bodies, although they don't feel like they own their bodies either. In fact, they increasingly feel like slaves, don't they? And they use that word purposely to describe their condition. Now, let me interject something here that's very interesting and I think very important. And that is that I would like you to think about how prominent in our culture is the notion that if you are a wage laborer, you're kind of a slave to the man, right? Which is to say differently, I want you to think about how, in many respects, our culture naturally cannot even describe itself, in spite of the fact that slavery was abolished in 1865, our culture can hardly explain aspects of itself without self-consciously and reflexively referring to itself as a culture and political system that produces slavery almost all the time. So maybe you've done away with slavery, but guess what? 2 decades later, you have people who were never enslaved, who weren't African, who came from Europe. And what do you have them talking about? You have them saying, we are essentially enslaved to whom? The money power. Now, whether or not that's factually true is less important than the fact that culturally that's how we think. Now, why bring that up? Well, one of the overarching themes in this course, of course, is going to be the legacy of slavery. Well, let me just say, clearly, the fact that we can't talk about this stuff without people who were never slaves referring to themselves as slaves speaks to the power, the cultural power of our national biography. So that rural farmers, by the way, millions of whom were black in the South, but also millions of white farmers, if you will, European farmers, immigrants, recent immigrants who've only been in the country 15 or 20 years but grabbed some land through the Homestead Act, notice that they themselves adopt this notion that we are slaves. Now, remember, the distinction between rural farmers and industrial factory workers frequently was that rural farmers actually had some property. They had some stuff. They weren't propertyless. But the story we read the other day is the story of how they struggle to keep their property. And notice, by keeping their property, keeping their freedom. Which brings up another point, and that is the relationship between freedom and property. So that, let me just ask you, might it be possible for a propertyless, industrialized factory worker to say, I don't have any freedom because all I do is work 12 hours a day for horrible wages, and I live in hovels, I live in trash, I live in horrible circumstances. Jacob Riis's pictures in your textbook, right? I live in horrible circumstances. I'm just a slave. So the point that I want to make is that these people weren't crazy. They weren't making shit up. They weren't crazy. They are victims of a system that's stacked against them. Okay? I think we've made that pretty clear. And so the bigger picture I need you guys to see, and this is where the textbook comes together with the readings. You get the big picture from the textbook. You get the micro picture from the readings. You drill down deep in these readings, whereas when you read the textbook, it's general, touches on all of the high points that you're supposed to get in a history textbook. I want you to see that your job is to make sure that you tie this stuff together. That you see that we've got this big story that we're telling, and then we've got these very precise, specific stories that we're telling, which hopefully illustrate the bigger picture. You follow me? Now, studies show that when teachers talk about their pedagogy and the way that they teach, it actually helps students participate more in that particular kind of learning. So notice what I'm doing right now. I am transparently trying to explain to you why we do what we do and why we do it in the way that we do it. Right? So it's important for you to kind of understand what we're doing here so that you can do the bigger thing, which is to say, take this big picture that you're getting from Global ICM that we never talk about, and fill in the empty spaces with these very precise and longer readings that allow us to see the connections between, for instance, industrial factory workers, rural farmers, and the larger system of industrialization in this country, okay? And I'll finish this part by simply saying that, again, if I were to build this course around a question, a single question, this would be the question. If systematic discrimination existed, what might it look like? Notice that that's not a question that says systematic discrimination exists. It's a question that asks if it existed, what might it look like? And I think that that's a good question to help us get our hands around what might in 2018 be systematic discrimination. So that if we can understand how systematic discrimination worked 150 years ago, maybe we can understand how it might work today if it exists. Okay? All right. With that in mind, Savannah, get us started here. How does Fraser characterize the fear-mongering about the working classes in the U.S. in the decades after the Civil War? What were people saying? And who were those people? So what I'd like you to do, first of all, is focus on the fear-mongering by telling me what kinds of things people were saying about the working class.
They're un-American.
Okay, un-American?
And it said something about how they're Slavic wolves.
They're Slavic wolves. Why? What's the word Slavic mean?
Working? Or
No. Slavic. Come on. Huh? No. No. No.
Unequal.
No. If you're Slavic, where are you from? Huh? Russia. Where else? Ukraine, Russia, Ukraine, former Yugoslavia, Eastern Europe. Slavic. Okay? All right. So notice they're called Slavic wolves. Right? What's that? What do you think of that, Savannah, that they're called Slavic wolves?
that they worked to death and they just kept working.
Okay, that they worked to death? I don't think so. Brian?
That they would travel in packs. Pretty much.
Okay, I hadn't thought of that they'd travel in packs.
Because they all, like one comes and
No,
then
that's
like
not
the rest
bad,
of them.
although I don't think that's what they're saying either, but that's not bad. Is it Deandra?
Yeah.
Yeah, Deandra? I'm on the Slavic wolves thing.
Yeah, so it says Slavic wolves of filthy freaks. So I'm
Okay, Slavic wolves and filthy freaks,
no,
but
of filthy freaks. So I'm thinking it means like these people are coming in packs, but I'm guessing they're filthy or they're dirty.
they are absolutely filthy, but as far as the wolves metaphor goes, what's that mean?
I'm not sure.
That they're hungry for money? Or hungry for work or land or...
Okay, I like your work here, Brian. You're doing good. I like it. But again, what's the difference between a wolf and a domesticated dog?
One's wild and one's...
That's right. The wolf is wild.
And it's needing, like, it doesn't have protection like a dog does, kind of.
Wolves?
Yeah. Because they're out in the
You ever
wild.
seen a wolf fight?
Okay, like I'm saying, like, they have
They kill mooses or mises,
yeah,
whatever the
because
plural is of moose.
they need to.
Huh?
They need to. Like,
They need to.
yes.
Yeah, but they can, right? And they are,
They-
right?
yeah.
Okay.
They have their freedom.
Right, so notice, we're not calling them poodles. They're not Slavic poodles. They'd have to be French to be that. No, I'm just joking. We're calling them Slavic wolves, which is to say, subhuman animals.
It also says for them to be treated as savages.
Yeah, that's right. So another word that's used with reference to them is that they're savages. Who were the original savages in this country? I'm not saying they were savages, by the way, but who were perceived as the first savages? Native Americans, right? By the way, the Native Americans looked at these crazy Europeans in their weird-ass clothing and their crazy hats and their crazy shoes and thought, who are these savages? Right? Who are these people? How do they live? Right? I mean, there was a lot of cultural misunderstanding across that barrier, but again, it makes them equal with Native Americans, who, by the way, by the 1880s and 1890s, what had happened to them? Pardon? Well, they hadn't disappeared. They were put on reservations, which became smaller and smaller and smaller. And oh, by the way, in the 1880s, what had the development of the railroads and guys with long rifles done to their most precious resource, the buffalo? Killed them all. Almost extinct, right? Okay. So, savages, she says, filthy freaks. Why is it true that these people were filthy? Maritel? I mean, were they filthy? Were they filthy?
Yeah. No.
No, they weren't filthy. Okay, well, make your argument.
No, they weren't savages. They were just.
I'm not asking about savages. I'm asking about filthy. Were they filthy people?
No, they weren't.
Okay, why do you say they weren't filthy? What do you mean?
They just were looking for work, and when they got it, the people who hired them wanted to treat them as savages, filthy savages.
Okay, all right, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. I get where you're going, but Alex, how about you? Do you think these people were actually filthy?
I think in what they were doing, maybe?
Okay, well, let me ask this. Who wants to say, yes, these people were filthy and this is why? Okay, Rosa, I'm coming to you. I'm running. Come on over here. Come on. Get the camera. Come on, camera. All right. I'm behaving like a savage here. All right. Rosa, why would you say these people were filthy?
Because on the place they worked, that's what made them filthy.
Right. I mean, look at one of these guys, or women for that matter, who did work in factories, although they generally did jobs that were, shall we say, less physically demanding and less inhumane, because, of course, women were treated as, shall we say, weaker vessels, right? But the point is, you look at these people at any point during their day, even when they're at home and they're filthy, right? They got coal under their eyes, their fingernails are filthy, they got no manicures, I mean, gee whiz, no pedicures, right? I mean, the point is, they actually are filthy. And notice, they live in filth. Right? And it's their fault, right? Who says yes? Oh, Brian, this is going to be fun. All right, Brian. Woo, you're a bold man. Tell us why it's their fault.
Because they chose that life. They didn't seek for something better.
Okay, they chose that life in that what? They chose to move here from, let's say they were Jewish and Slavic and they ran away from the Ukraine in 1880, 1890 because of the Jewish pogroms where Jews were being killed. So they left, they fled for their life, and they went to America with the Statue of Liberty, which says, give us your poor, your tired, your huddled masses. They chose to come to this country unprepared, couldn't speak the language, and they chose to just get any work they could get. Well, wait a second. I'm not down to Brian here. Right. And you say, well, they chose that. Well, of course they chose it. Well, of course they chose it. Does anybody dispute that they chose to emigrate to America? Yeah. Does anybody dispute that? No, of course they chose. And they came here and they found jobs, right? Where they could. Did they choose to find those jobs? Of course they chose to find those jobs. You can't do anything without choosing, right? So Brian, I would argue, is partially right. Of course they chose it, right? But does that mean they're responsible for their situation?
No.
Okay, thank you, Brian. I'm glad I can back off of you. So they're not responsible, although they chose. All right. Sam, right? Samantha? Who's responsible? If they're not responsible, who's responsible?
The industries, like...
Right. That's exactly right. So, yes, Rosa, they're filthy. Are they filthy because they choose to be filthy? No. They're filthy because they can't attain any other life that would keep them clean, to use the metaphor, right? Pay them more, and they'll be able to get out of their filth, right? Okay. Of course they chose. We all choose to do what we have to do, but here's the point. There are very narrow paths for people. Not all people. By the way, in general, how do you broaden that path for yourself and increase the range of choices you can make as an economic actor?
You create them yourself.
Well, okay, you create them yourself, but how do you do that?
You set yourself aside from others, or you, how do you say it? You make yourself different than others.
How do you do that?
Education.
Education, skills, you get a trade, something like that. You get training, right? And what happens is you increase the path that you can walk down. For you guys, you already know that you've got to get that college degree, right? You're not the people who chose to go to trade school, although that's a good place to go. You're not the people who said, no, I'm going to become a welder or a truck driver, which, by the way, is honorable and that's great. Want to be a professional bass fisherman? That's fine. That's your choice, right? You can do that. And there's nothing dishonorable about that, but you guys understand that if you get that bachelor's degree, it's going to make the range of possibilities larger for you, and it's going to, on average, increase the amount of money you're going to make over your career. So, for instance, if your first job you get after college is worth $10,000 more a year than the job you would have had without college, and then you multiply that times 43, which would be the age from 22 to 65, notice that you will have made $430,000 extra dollars at least over the course of your lifetime. If you take 25% of that and put it in the bank, you've now put $107,000 in the bank over 40 years, and you're going to have $3 million to take care of your children and your grandchildren. No.
Don't some people get screwed over by the banks?
Well, okay. Now, Brian's done again. Okay. So you remember my story. The Farrells, get our promotions. My wife gets her degree. I become Dr. Farrell, blah, blah, blah. Now we're earning some money. I go buy a $660,000 house. The market crashes in 2008. I purchased it in 2006, and then we moved in 2016. We short sold it for $300,000 when we bought it for $660,000. Now I want you to know I'm not complaining, although I could complain, but that was one of the worst decisions of my life. Did I choose it? Of course I chose it. Am I responsible for it? Hell no, I'm not responsible for it. It was the irresponsibility of Wall Street, and in particular the banks that drove the real estate bubble. It's their fault. That's why, by the way, I'll tell you honestly, that's why I had no compunction when I stopped making my house payments and continued to live in the house for 3.5 years. So look what happened to me. This is the point, and this gets to Brian's point. What happened to me is my wife and I, in our 40s, bought our dream house that we thought was going to go from $660,000 to $750,000 to $850,000. Now we have equity in it, right? It's our house forever. It was beautiful. It was our dream house. It's the American dream at work, right? Instead, boom. And we lost 15 years of our economic life. And if we're lucky, in another year, at age 56, and my wife will be a little older, because I married an older woman, who I met when I was a sophomore in high school and she was a senior, but we won't get into that, all right? Just saying. And by the way, she came up to me. I didn't go up. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. Actually, that is true, but I'm also joking. What was I going to say? So the point is that maybe in another year or two, we might be able to buy another house, which means we lost 15, 16, 17 years of our economic life. And hundreds of thousands of dollars, not because it was our fault, although it was our choice, it's because of the banks and their misbehavior and the markets and their misbehavior, right? Okay. So, then, the fear-mongering, all I want you to see is that these working class people are described in terms that scream out, be afraid of them. Now, in fairness, Mr. Olmos, in fairness, over the course of these 2 decades that we're looking at, did they behave like wolves?
Sometimes.
Explain.
Well, during the time the wolves were done like that to put them as a symbol as being more dominant than the other ones. And what I mean by other ones is I mean by race, so more or less white supremacy always ran the industry, which was sort of like the wolves. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm just going to continue talking.
You're running down the road, and I can see you, grasping for stuff, but you're actually, I like what you're doing. You're trying to pull big stuff together. I like that.
And
but you're also admitting you don't know what the hell you're saying.
Yeah.
Did I go to somebody else?
Yeah.
Brittany, did they behave like wolves? I mean, seriously. Is it fair to say they behave like wolves?
No.
Why do you say no? Didn't they engage in massive strikes?
Oh, the mass strike.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Didn't they break windows and
kill,
ruin property and?
Didn't they kill people?
Huh? I'll buy it.
I feel like if they were characterized as
By the way, let me just say, I love what's happening right now. I swear to God, if you could see this as a teacher, I mean, not all eyes, but most eyes are on me. You guys can't even wait to say stuff. That's why this kind of education works if you buy into it, right? Okay? Anyway, Karina, right? Huh? No. Is it Karina? Okay, there we go. I'm good.
I just feel like if they were characterized as wolves, they're gonna act like wolves. They're like, "You stay, I am. I'm gonna be it." That's why they were striking. That's why they were.
They're playing their part. Their name's something new. They try to act like that's something
Yeah.
they're called.
Okay, let's see. Yuna? Shh. I appreciate you guys, but one person at a time.
Well, yes, you could say they're acting like wolves because wolves are basically at the top of the food chain. So they want to be at the top. So they were protesting and making their moves to make sure that they got the justice that they needed for
That's
the work
right.
that was being done. So yes, they were being wolves.
Right, and they certainly weren't being French poodles, right? I mean, they are actually getting nasty to the tune of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people going out on the streets to shut down, for instance, the entire railroad transportation system in the whole country through mass strikes, right? That is something. That's not nothing, that's something. And why are they doing it, Heaven? In general, why are they doing it? What is their point?
To gain power, I think. Because if
Well, okay, but wait. That's actually not what they say they're doing it for. Why are they doing it?
Because, okay, if someone's like pushing me around, I'm obviously gonna rebel just to be like state a point and like make you know that I want to be equal with you, and just because you're like on a higher level than me and I'm over here working in the mines being in feces, I want to be up here with you.
Okay. Fair enough. But let me ask you this. Are they doing it as individuals? In other words, is Heaven just getting up and saying, I've had enough? Are they doing it as individuals?
No, because they're all
doing it
in a group.
as an entire class.
Yeah,
of
you're
people.
bigger and better whenever you're.
Why do they have to do that?
To have a voice.
Huh?
To have a voice. They're trying to be equal with others, and like they're working like twice as hard just to like not get shit.
Okay. Listen, I think I can cuss in here, but you probably shouldn't. No, I'm joking. So, Ricky, you said they're doing it why? To make a change, or stated differently, to actually have political power. You can't do it alone. You've got to band together, and you've got to leverage your communal activities. You've got to leverage them however you can, right? Okay, and so what do? You go out on strike. Huh? And packs, right. And if you have to get nasty because they're getting nasty with you, they're killing people, they're busting heads, the cops are coming out, the National Guard's coming out, people are getting killed, right? Well, if your people are getting killed, what might you do? You might fight back. That's right. And so then, without getting into the dynamics so much of this mass strike, because we're running out of time, to not get into those dynamics all that much, notice that you need the mass movement if you are a disenfranchised factory worker or a rural farmer. If you are going to be effective against this, you better have a bunch of people on your side, right? Okay, Brian, what were you going to say?
But wouldn't the industries try to kill off like the leader of the pack pretty much so that they wouldn't have no one to follow, so that it would stop the mass strikes?
Yeah, and to jump ahead, I mean what question number 4 says, explain the blunt instrument.
They were being straight up, but they were using it in different ways.
Well, the blunt instrument isn't the masses here. Who's using the blunt instrument? Rosa? Who's using the blunt instrument? Okay, you said industry? Yes. Who else? Government? Yes. Karen? Who else? That's right, the National Guard. Who else? What's that? Local law enforcement, National Guard, sometimes the military generally, right? Who else? The banks, okay. Who else?
Everybody in charge of money.
Okay? But even at a higher level, the courts, remember? So that word injunction in your text, a court injunction says what you're doing is illegal and you must stop. Now notice, these people are asking for an 8-hour workday. That's what I was after earlier. I mean, that's pretty much it. We just want an 8-hour workday. But of course, they had to do all this other stuff. They want an 8-hour workday. They want to have the right to collectively bargain. In other words, for unions to be legalized. Unions were illegal. Right? And they want to go out and they want to work together. They want to have the right, as you say, Heaven, to exercise power, but power as a group, as a mass, because that's the only way that they can organize sufficiently against this group, which is using blunt instruments. Now, getting to the end of the story, how'd that work out? Isla, how did that work out? What ultimately happens by the end of the 19th century? Brian?
The industry wins.
Huh?
The industry wins.
Industry wins for the most part. That's right. Are unions legalized? No. Okay, ladies, everybody, your phones. You shouldn't be playing with your phones right now. This is serious business we're doing here, and I don't like it when you guys jack around. Have I not made that clear? It's offensive. All right, let me see if I can regain my stability here. Yeah, the blunt instrument, but notice that it contributed to the emergence of what the author says is an industrial peasantry. What's an industrial peasantry? Sue, what's an industrial peasantry? Okay, let me see. I want to say Deandra, but that's not. It's Desiree.
See, I say the same thing.
I almost called you bacon. Desiree, go ahead. What was my question? Oh, what's the industrial peasantry?
I feel like it was a revolution. It was start.
Okay. All right. Let's stick on the word peasantry for a minute.
The peasant, someone that's lower than them.
Yeah. Peasants are poor people who generally, in some way, whether it's through serfdom or otherwise, are enslaved, right? And so notice then, in the end, what happens is this blunt instrument creates an industrial peasantry. Do these people win? The answer is no, they don't. Do these people win? The answer is no, they don't. Populism, the Populist Party, has some effect, right? But does it set up a Federal Reserve Bank? No. Does it regulate the railroads? Not all that much. Okay? So what I want you to see is that all of this violence is actually effectively counterbalanced by the people in power, who are, by the way, the people who are fear-mongering. Notice, it's the industrialists, it's the bankers, it's the governors, it's the president, it's many religious leaders who are, in fact, fear-mongering. Calling these people the horrible names that we've talked about. You know, these are descriptions that come from people in power, and in the case of religious leaders, that are, shall we say, opinion shapers. Right? Which brings us then to question number 3, which is to say that, well, not all religious leaders were biased. So let's talk about question number 3. Brian, I'm coming to you, man. So you got a few minutes here, a few seconds to. Did I say Brian? I mean Christian. Christian, I'm coming to you. I'm getting away from Brian. He's bugging me. Brian's bugging me today. Just joking. So Christian, number 3, insurgent labor. By the way, that's what we're talking about. Insurgent labor. Insurgent labor was most often secular and anti-clerical. I'm not so concerned about that, except to say that it is true that whether we're talking about Europe or we're talking about the United States, over the course of industrialization, it is true that the working classes became increasingly non-religious. They left church, okay? So I'm not concerned about that as much. I'm concerned about the second part of it, which says, still, Jesus could be a comrade. Explain what this means.
That Jesus would be an enemy still?
No, he's a comrade. Comrades are brothers.
I don't know.
Rosa? How is it that Jesus could be a comrade? I just said that religious leaders were capping on these people too.
Yeah, but not. They didn't represent God. Like maybe he was trying to help them.
No,
Like they were
no,
thinking that.
no. What?
Having belief, like faith, like having God on their side, like was feeling like that should work.
Okay, one person at a time, please. All right, I think I'm gonna. I saw some hands over here. I'll come back. I'll give you a hint.
He was still there.
I'll give you a hint. It's social gospel.
It's like when he's still there, even though like he's not there. Like you could not believe in something, but he's still there.
Uh-huh. Una?
Maybe they were attending church or something.
Okay.
Oh, I thought that whenever like you're doing labor, like you're working and like you don't want to be doing it, but then you're like, oh, Jesus is my comrade. I could always come back to Jesus.
Brian, what are you gonna say?
That Jesus was pretty much like their hope or something. Or, damn it.
Okay, you guys are dancing around it. Maybe you didn't pick up on it. That's fine. Maybe it's something I was looking at and you couldn't see it. That's fine. This is how bias works and interest works. Let me just say this. The social gospel movement was a swath or a portion of organized Christian religion that was not conservative in nature, that would not have sided with the acquisitive over the weak. Okay? The social gospel movement are, for lack of a more precise term, emerging progressives who think that, for instance, the middle classes, like them, that's who these social gospel people are. They're pastors and church members and business people, but they have a different mind about them. They're not stressing the wolf nature of and the chaos of the working class. They are stressing instead the poverty of the class, right? So, sometimes when fundamentalist Christians ask, what would Jesus do? Their answer is, he wouldn't smoke grass, he wouldn't take LSD, he wouldn't have premarital sex, and oh, by the way, he wouldn't like people like that. That's one answer to what would Jesus do. Another answer to what would Jesus do from a different perspective is, he would spend all of his time with the poor and the weak and the downtrodden. You see that? And the social gospel movement, they were saying exactly that. And another thing I want you guys to think about, and I've got readings built into this course to kind of wrestle with it, is the impact of religion on our history. Mostly Christianity, because we claim to be a Christian nation, but this is another thing I want you guys to be thinking about. Okay? So it's not as though all Christians were opposed to these poor people, but a surprisingly large number of them were. And that might be disturbing, right? Because after all, the Savior himself is going to accuse these people of being Slavic wolves and worthless and worthy of being shot and put in prison, right? Okay. See you later. That's it.